Decades of working the rich soil of Willow Creek Valley had carved deep lines into Jackson Miller's weathered face, now streaked with tears of humiliation as Mayor Thompson prepared to deliver the council's decision. No one could have predicted how this seemingly routine zoning dispute would lead to a presidential motorcade rolling down the dusty road to Miller's farm, forever changing their forgotten rural community. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jackson Miller stood motionless in the packed city council chambers, his sun-weathered face etched with fear and exhaustion. His work-hardened hands, now trembling slightly, clutched a faded blue cap against his chest like a shield. The once respected farmer, known throughout Willow Creek for his heritage organic vegetables and community involvement, now looked small and defeated beneath the imposing council bench. The modern municipal building with its gleaming floors and polished wooden panels seemed to mock the dirt and calluses that marked him as a man of the earth. Around him, the council chambers buzzed with whispers and judgment, faces he'd known his entire life. Neighbors, fellow farmers, and local shopkeepers all stared at him with a mix of pity and disapproval. Some had known him since he was a boy working alongside his grandfather in the fertile fields that had fed their community for generations. Now they watched him like spectators at a public execution, their whispers cutting through the air like autumn wind through bare branches. The morning sun streamed through tall windows, casting harsh shadows across the polished floor, much like the shadows that had been creeping across Jackson's own life over the past year. The light caught the silver threads in his prematurely graying hair, evidence of the strain that had aged him well beyond his 52 years. His once straight shoulders, which had carried bushels of produce and bales of hay with pride, now slumped under the weight of shame and uncertainty. At the council bench sat Mayor Thompson, a man whose meteoric rise from real estate developer to town leader had been fueled by promises of revitalization and economic opportunity. His steel-gray eyes peered down at Jackson with barely concealed contempt, his expression as cold and unyielding as the gavel he gripped in his hand. The mayor's presence seemed to fill the entire room, making even the council members shift uncomfortably in their positions. Mayor Thompson was known for his unwavering dedication to progress, a man who had never planted a seed but sat in judgment of those who had spent lifetimes nurturing the land. The council chamber clock ticked loudly in the tense silence, each second echoing like a death knell for a way of life that was vanishing before their eyes. In the front row sat Sarah Miller, Jackson's wife of 30 years, her fingers working the worn fabric of her best dress, the same one she'd worn to every community function for the past decade. Beside her sat their daughter Emma, her face a mask of indignation and hurt as she watched her father, her hero, standing trial like a common troublemaker. Behind them, taking up nearly 2 full rows, sat the representatives of Horizon Development Corporation, their crisp suits and polished shoes standing in stark contrast to the working clothes of the local farmers who filled the rest of the chamber. At their center sat Victor Lawrence, the regional director, his perfectly manicured hands folded neatly in his lap, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth as he watched the proceedings with the detached interest of a man already counting his profits. The air in the council chambers grew heavier with each passing moment, thick with the unspoken stories of drought, debt, and desperation that had brought them all to this point. The ancient heating system hummed somewhere in the building's bowels, its sound mixing with the rustle of papers and the occasional cough from the gallery. Through the tall windows, the farms of Willow Creek Valley could be seen stretching into the distance, their early spring fields showing the first tentative signs of green, a stark contrast to the coldness that permeated the chambers. Council Officer Jenkins, who had coached Jackson's baseball team 30 years ago, now stood rigid beside him, avoiding eye contact with the man he'd once celebrated as a local hero. The American flag behind the council bench hung still and solemn, its stars and stripes a silent witness to the drama unfolding beneath it. On the mayor's desk, a stack of papers told the official story: zoning applications, property assessments, and development plans that reduced Jackson Miller's life to a series of cold, legal facts. The whole scene seemed surreal, like something from a movie, rather than the real life of a man who had spent his entire existence tending the land and feeding his community. But as Mayor Thompson cleared his throat, preparing to begin the proceedings, the reality of the situation came crashing down on Jackson with devastating clarity. His fingers tightened around his cap, the worn fabric crinkling slightly under. The pressure as he prepared to face whatever judgment this morning would bring. "The matter before this council today," Mayor Thompson began, his voice cutting through the silence like a scythe through wheat, "concerns the repeated violations of Municipal Ordinance 47B by Jackson Miller, specifically the unauthorized use of residential zoned property for commercial agricultural purposes and the deliberate obstruction of approved development activities." The mayor's words hung in the air as he shuffled through the papers before him, each movement deliberate and measured. Victor Lawrence rose smoothly from his seat, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the hardwood floor as he approached. The podium, the regional director of Horizon Development, carried himself with the confident air of a man accustomed to getting his way. "Mr. Mayor, distinguished council members," Lawrence began, his voice cultured and smooth as aged whiskey, "Horizon Development has invested over $15 million in our Willow Creek Commons project. This development represents the future of this community, creating jobs, expanding the tax base, and bringing modern amenities to a town that has been overlooked for far too long. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." He turned slightly, ensuring the council could see his practiced expression of corporate concern. "Mr. Miller's farm sits directly adjacent to our primary construction site. His refusal to comply with zoning regulations isn't just a technical violation. It's actively undermining economic progress that will benefit everyone in Willow Creek." From her seat in the front row, Sarah Miller watched her husband's shoulders tense at the word violation. She remembered when Jackson had been called other things: community pillar, mentor, the man who donated half his harvest to the food bank during the recession. For 20 years, he'd organized the Willow Creek Harvest Festival, bringing the community together to celebrate their agricultural heritage. Now he stood alone, branded a troublemaker by the very officials who had once praised his commitment to their town. Town Attorney Rebecca Chen approached the council with precise steps, her reputation as Thompson's most loyal ally, making her a natural choice for presenting the case against Jackson. "The evidence will show that Mr. Miller has repeatedly ignored cease and desist orders regarding his agricultural activities. Furthermore, he has encouraged public demonstrations that have interfered with legally permitted development work, resulting in costly delays for Horizon Development and, by extension, lost tax revenue for our community." Jackson's attorney, Peter Donnelly, shifted in his chair. A semi-retired local lawyer who had taken on Jackson's case pro bono, he was ill-equipped to challenge the formidable legal resources arrayed against his client. His outdated suit and disorganized notes stood in stark contrast to the polished corporate legal team facing him across the chamber. "Mr. Miller has converted what was originally a small family garden into a full-scale commercial farming operation," Chen continued, her voice sharp with accusation. "The property is clearly zoned residential, not agricultural. These violations have persisted despite multiple warnings and citations over the past 18 months. In the gallery, Old Martha Wilson, who owned the local diner, leaned forward with concern etched on her weathered face. She remembered how Jackson had provided fresh produce for her restaurant for decades, often at reduced prices during tough economic times. She recalled how he had helped her grandson start a small herb garden behind the diner, refusing payment even though his own farm was struggling financially. Now Martha watched helplessly as her friend faced the loss of his land and livelihood. The prosecution's table was crowded with corporate lawyers, their tablets displaying slideshow presentations about zoning regulations, economic forecasts, and property values. Each of them carried folders thick with municipal codes, development permits, and economic impact statements, the paper weapons of modern rural transformation. Council Secretary Jennifer Adams had grown up in Willow Creek herself before pursuing her administrative career. As she organized the day's documents, she couldn't help but notice how the case file told two very different stories. One was filled with corporate spreadsheets, architectural renderings, and promises of economic revitalization. The other contained photographs of the Miller family working the land, letters of support from community members, and a detailed history of a farm that had fed the community through good times and bad for over a century. Emma Miller, 28 and now, working as an agricultural scientist at the State University, sat rigid beside her mother. Her mind wandered to the previous summer when she'd proudly told her father about her research into sustainable farming practices, research inspired by the methods he had taught her since childhood. Now she watched as that same father stood accused of crimes that threatened to destroy not just their family's legacy, but their entire way of life. At the defense table, Jackson finally looked up, his eyes meeting those of Victor Lawrence. The corporate executive's slight smirk spoke volumes about the power imbalance in the room. Lawrence represented a new breed of developers, one who saw small towns like Willow Creek not as communities with history and character, but as undervalued assets ripe for transformation. His world was one of investor presentations and profit projections, far removed from the earthy reality of Jackson's daily existence. The morning light continued to stream through the high windows, creating a spotlight effect on the council chamber floor. To one side stood the might of corporate development, suits, briefcases, and the weight of millions in investment capital. To the other, a single farmer in his Sunday best, his calloused hands marking him as a man who worked the land rather than exploited it from afar. Mayor Thompson cleared his throat, preparing to move the formal proceedings along. The weight of expectation hung heavy in the air. This case would do more than decide the fate of Jackson Miller. It would send a message about the future of Willow Creek, about whether the town's agricultural heritage would be preserved or paved over in the name of progress. Mr. Lawrence, the mayor nodded. Please continue your testimony regarding the impact of Mr. Miller's actions on your development project. Lawrence activated a large screen mounted on the council chamber wall, displaying a sleek rendering of Willow Creek Commons, a sprawling complex of condominiums, retail spaces, and a luxury hotel that would dominate the town's modest skyline. As you can see, Lawrence continued, zooming in on a particular section of the plans, Phase 1 of our development directly borders Mr. Miller's property. His continued agricultural activities have created dust, odor, and pest control issues that have already caused prospective tenants to express concerns. He clicked to the next slide, showing a group of protesters holding signs at the development site entrance. More concerning are the demonstrations Mr. Miller has organized, which have repeatedly blocked access to our construction site, resulting in delays that have cost Horizon over $200,000 to date. Lawrence's presentation painted a picture of Jackson as a stubborn relic of the past, selfishly standing in the way of inevitable progress. With each slide, the whispers in the gallery grew louder, some nodding in agreement with the developers, assessment, others shaking their heads in dismay at the transformation being proposed. Furthermore, Lawrence continued, his voice hardening, our environmental consultants have documented runoff from Mr. Miller's organic farming operation affecting soil composition on our property. These contaminants, particularly the non-standard fertilizers he insists on using, could potentially compromise our building foundations if allowed to continue. At this, Emma Miller stood abruptly, unable to contain herself. That's a blatant lie. My father's organic methods are scientifically proven to improve soil health, not damage it. Order! Mayor Thompson's gavel crashed down. Ms. Miller, you will have your chance to speak during the public comment period. Another outburst like that, and I'll have you removed from these chambers. Emma sank back into her seat, her cheeks burning with anger and embarrassment as Sarah squeezed her hand in silent support. Jackson kept his eyes forward, but his jaw had tightened noticeably at the false accusations being leveled against his farming practices. Peter Donnelly, Jackson's attorney, finally rose to cross-examine Lawrence. Despite his disorganized appearance, a lifetime of representing the people of Willow Creek had given him a shrewd understanding of local politics and a deep reservoir of community knowledge. Mr. Lawrence, Donnelly began, his voice stronger than his frail appearance would suggest, your company purchased the land for Willow Creek Commons 18 months ago. Is that correct? Yes, that's correct, Lawrence replied dismissively. And at that time, the Miller farm had already been in operation for how long? Lawrence shifted slightly. I'm not sure of the exact. Would it surprise you to learn that the Miller family has been farming that same plot of land continuously since 1897, over 120 years before your company arrived in Willow Creek? History isn't relevant to current zoning laws, Lawrence countered smoothly. Perhaps not, Donnelly acknowledged, but community character is explicitly mentioned in Section 3 of our town charter as a factor to be considered in all development decisions. He produced a worn copy of the charter from his briefcase, holding it up for the council to see. Mayor Thompson intervened quickly. Mr. Donnelly, please confine your questions to relevant matters. The historical operation of Mr. Miller's farm doesn't change the current zoning designation. Donnelly persisted, undeterred by the mayor's obvious bias. Mr. Lawrence, are you aware that your company's application for rezoning the former Wilson property from agricultural to mixed-use commercial was approved in record time, just 11 days after submission? Lawrence smiled thinly. We worked closely with the planning department to ensure our application met all requirements. So closely that you had dinner with Mayor Thompson the night before the Planning Commission's vote, Donnelly pressed. Objection! Town Attorney Chen jumped to her feet. This line of questioning is inappropriate and irrelevant to the matter at hand. Mayor Thompson's face had darkened noticeably. Sustained. Mr. Donnelly, I'm warning you to stay focused on the specific violations cited against your client. The tension in the room had shifted palpably. Several council members exchanged uncomfortable glances, and whispers rippled through the gallery as citizens processed this unexpected information about their mayor's relationship with the developer. Donnelly nodded respectfully but continued his questioning. Just one more question, Mr. Lawrence. Your environmental impact statement claims that Willow Creek Commons will create minimal disruption to local water systems. Are you aware that your development site sits directly above the aquifer that supplies water to over 60% of the farms in Willow Creek Valley? Lawrence hesitated, clearly unprepared for this question. Our environmental consultants have assured. Your consultants, Donnelly interrupted, who never spoke with local farmers or the county water authority. The same consultants who failed to identify the seasonal creek that runs through your property because they conducted their survey. During a drought year, the gallery erupted in murmurs as Lawrence struggled to regain his composure. Jackson sat a little straighter, a flicker of hope crossing his face for the first time since the proceedings began. His attorney might be outmatched in resources, but decades of local knowledge were proving difficult for Lawrence to counter. Mayor Thompson intervened again, clearly rattled by this turn in the questioning. "We'll take a 15-minute recess before continuing with testimony." His gavel crashed down with unnecessary force, and he strode quickly from the chamber, motioning for the town attorney to follow him. During the recess, the council chambers buzzed with conversation. Small groups formed in the gallery, some casting sympathetic glances toward Jackson, others huddled with the Horizon Development representatives. Council members spoke in hushed tones among themselves, occasionally glancing toward the empty mayor's chair. Sarah Miller approached her husband, embracing him briefly before whispering in his ear. "Professor Abernathy is here. He brought the water study." Jackson's eyes widened slightly, a mix of surprise and cautious hope crossing his weathered features. Dr. James Abernathy, head of environmental sciences at the State University and Emma's mentor, was a nationally recognized expert on water conservation and agricultural sustainability. His presence could lend crucial credibility to Jackson's cause. As the recess neared its end, Jackson noticed something unusual. Two men in dark suits had entered the chamber, quietly taking positions near the doors. Their alert posture and discreet earpieces marked them as something other than local security. Jackson nudged his attorney, nodding subtly toward the newcomers. Donnelly frowned, equally puzzled by their appearance. Federal marshals, maybe? But why would they be interested in a local zoning dispute? Before they could speculate further, Mayor Thompson returned to the chamber, his earlier confidence noticeably diminished. He conferred briefly with the town clerk before taking his seat and calling the session back to order. "The council will now hear testimony from the respondent, Mr. Jackson Miller," Thompson announced, his voice lacking its earlier edge. "Mr. Miller, please approach the podium and remember that you are under oath." Jackson rose slowly, straightening his weathered flannel shirt as he made his way to the front of the chamber. Standing before the council, he seemed to grow taller, drawing strength from the generations of farmers whose blood ran through his veins. When he spoke, his voice was clear and steady, carrying the quiet authority of a man who had spent a lifetime in honest labor. "I've lived in Willow Creek my entire life," Jackson began, his eyes moving across the familiar faces of the council members. "The land you're calling a zoning violation has been farmed by my family for 5 generations. My great-grandfather grew wheat and corn there to feed this town during the Depression. My grandfather expanded into vegetables that supplied every restaurant in the county. My father taught me how to care for the soil like it was a living thing, because it is." Jackson paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing. "When the zoning ordinances were updated in 1992, our farm was designated residential without our knowledge or consent. We continued farming as we always had, and for 30 years, no one from the town ever suggested we were in violation of anything." He produced a stack of faded documents from his pocket. "I have tax records showing. We've paid agricultural tax rates on that property continuously since before most people in this room were born. Every mayor and council until now has recognized our farm's right to exist through these tax assessments." Mayor Thompson shifted uncomfortably in his seat as Jackson handed the documents to the council secretary. Several council members leaned forward with interest, examining the records that clearly contradicted the town's current position. "As for the accusations about protests and obstruction," Jackson continued, "I've never organized any demonstration. What Mr. Lawrence calls protests were actually community education events, people gathering to learn about sustainable farming and water conservation. Yes, these gatherings happen near the construction site, but on my property, not theirs." Jackson's voice grew stronger as he addressed the environmental accusations. The claim that my organic farming methods are contaminating their property isn't just wrong, it's backwards. Their excavation has already damaged the natural drainage, patterns that have existed for decades. After the last heavy rain, chemical runoff from their construction site killed an entire crop of heirloom tomatoes, plants from seeds my grandmother saved during World War II. In the gallery, heads nodded in recognition. Many citizens had purchased those same tomatoes at the farmer's market for years, their distinct flavor a staple of summer in Willow Creek. But this isn't just about my farm, Jackson continued, his gaze sweeping across the chamber. It's about what happens to our water. The development site sits directly above our town's primary aquifer. The plans for Willow Creek Commons include extensive underground parking and foundation systems that will disrupt natural water flow patterns. He turned to face Victor Lawrence directly. Mr. Lawrence and his company have intentionally hidden this fact from the council and the citizens of Willow Creek. Their own internal environmental assessment, which they never made public, shows significant risks to our water supply. Lawrence shot to his feet. That's a baseless accusation. Our environmental studies were all submitted with our application. Not all of them, came a new voice from the back of the chamber. All heads turned to see Dr. James Abernathy striding down the center aisle, his academics bearing commanding immediate attention. Behind him walked a younger man carrying a laptop and several thick binders. "Mr. Mayor," Abernathy called out, his voice carrying the authority of decades in academic research. "I apologize for interrupting, but this council needs to hear critical information before making any decision regarding Mr. Miller's farm." Mayor Thompson's face darkened with annoyance. "This is highly irregular. Who are you, and what gives you the right to interrupt these proceedings?" "I'm Dr. James Abernathy, Chair of Environmental Sciences at State University and Director of the Rural Water Conservation Initiative. With me is Michael Turner, a former environmental consultant for Horizon Development Corporation until 3 weeks ago, when he was terminated after raising concerns about their Willow Creek Commons project." Victor Lawrence shot up from his seat, face flushing red. "Objection! This is completely inappropriate. Dr. Abernathy has no standing in this matter, and Mr. Turner is bound by a confidentiality agreement." The young man with the laptop stepped forward. "I filed a whistleblower protection claim this morning. I have documentation of corporate malfeasance that directly relates to this case and poses a significant public health risk to the citizens of Willow Creek." Town Attorney Chen rose quickly. "Mr. Mayor, this is clearly a publicity stunt. The hearing should continue without interruption." Peter Donnelly found new energy, rising to his feet. "Your Honor, Mr. Mayor, I had no prior knowledge of these witnesses, but I move that the council hear them out. There could be crucial evidence relevant to public safety. These people are disgruntled academics and a terminated employee with an axe to grind," Lawrence scoffed. But the confident smile had vanished from his face. The two men in dark suits had moved closer to the proceedings, their attention now fully focused on the newcomers and the developing situation. Mayor Thompson raised his hand for silence, studying the newcomers with guarded interest. The certainty of moments before had been replaced by visible concern as he glanced between Dr. Abernathy and the mystery federal agents at the back of the room. "Approach the bench," Thompson commanded, his voice noticeably less confident. "Dr. Abernathy, Michael." Turner and the attorneys moved forward. Jackson watched from his position at the podium, hardly daring to breathe as an intense discussion unfolded in hushed tones. Council members strained to hear, their expressions shifting from confusion to concern as the whispered conference continued. After several tense minutes, Mayor Thompson straightened in his chair. "While this is highly unusual, I'm going to allow this testimony. The council will hear these witnesses, and their statements will be entered into the record." He fixed Dr. Abernathy with a stern look, but this had better be relevant to public safety as claimed. Dr. Abernathy took the podium as Jackson returned to his seat, the academic's distinguished appearance lending immediate gravitas to the proceedings. He placed a thick scientific report before him. For the past 3 years, my team has been conducting a comprehensive study of the North Valley Aquifer System, which supplies water to Willow Creek and surrounding communities. 6 months ago, we detected concerning changes in water quality and flow patterns in the precise area where Horizon Development began excavation for Willow Creek Commons. The professor opened his report, his professional demeanor unwavering as he detailed their findings. Our data shows that the development site contains a previously unmapped network of underground springs that serve as critical recharge points for the entire aquifer system. Disrupting these springs through deep excavation and foundation work poses a significant risk of permanent damage to the region's water supply. Michael Turner stepped forward, connecting his laptop to the chamber's display system. These are the original environmental assessment logs commissioned by Horizon Development, he explained, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. I personally conducted these studies and documented the spring network, along with my recommendation that the development plans be substantially modified to protect the aquifer. The young whistleblower pulled up a series of emails on the screen. This is the communication where I presented my findings to Horizon executives, including Mr. Lawrence. And this, he highlighted another email, is the response instructing me to revise my assessment to remove all mentions of the spring network and aquifer risks. The council chambers erupted in murmurs as citizens realized the implications. Jackson exchanged a glance with his wife and daughter, their expressions reflecting his own mixture of vindication and concern. When I refused to falsify my reports, Turner continued, I was terminated and replaced by a consultant who produced this. He displayed a much shorter, simplified report. This sanitized version is what was submitted to the town council with Horizon's application. Dr. Abernathy resumed his testimony, explaining in clear terms how the proposed development would likely result in contamination of the drinking water supply for not just Willow Creek, but several downstream communities as well. The Miller Farm, with its sustainable organic practices, has actually been serving as a natural filter for the aquifer, helping to maintain water quality throughout the region. Removing it would compound the damage from the development. The two men in suits had moved closer during this testimony, occasionally speaking into their wrist microphones. As Dr. Abernathy concluded his presentation, one of them approached the mayor and handed him a note. Thompson read it, his face draining of color. Lawrence attempted to regain control of the narrative. These claims are speculative at best. Our current environmental team has assured us. Your current team wasn't aware of this, Turner interrupted, displaying another document. This soil composition analysis from the excavation site shows high levels of industrial chemicals consistent with illegal dumping that occurred in the 1970s. Horizon purchased the property knowing about this contamination, but concealed it to avoid the costs of remediation. At this revelation, one of the suited men finally stepped forward. Mr. Mayor, council members, I'm Special Agent David Marshall with the Environmental Protection Agency's Criminal Investigation Division. We've been monitoring the situation at the Willow Creek development site following multiple anonymous tips regarding potential violations of the Clean Water Act. The chamber fell into stunned silence as the federal agent continued. Based on the evidence presented here today, combined with our ongoing investigation, I'm serving Mr. Lawrence and Horizon Development with this order to immediately cease all construction activities pending a comprehensive environmental review. The agent handed official documents to a visibly shaken Victor Lawrence, whose corporate composure had completely crumbled. Mayor Thompson, now ashen-faced, stared at the federal agent in disbelief. "Furthermore," Agent Marshall continued, "I can confirm that the EPA has been working with the Department of Agriculture on a special initiative to identify and preserve critical watershed protection zones. The Miller Farm has been under consideration for designation as a model site for this program, due to its exemplary sustainable practices and strategic location within the aquifer recharge zone." Jackson Miller sat stunned as the truth unfolded. His farm wasn't just important to his family's heritage, it was unknowingly serving as a crucial protection for the entire region's water supply. The very practices that Horizon had ridiculed as outdated were precisely what had maintained water quality for thousands of people downstream. The second suited man stepped forward. "I'm Robert Chen, Special Advisor to the President on Rural Affairs and Agricultural Sustainability. The President has taken a personal interest in the Willow Creek situation as a case study in balancing development with environmental protection and preservation of agricultural heritage." The revelation that White House representatives were present sent shockwaves through the chamber. Mayor Thompson, now visibly sweating, called for another recess to confer with the town attorney and council members. As the officials huddled in urgent conversation, Jackson found himself surrounded by neighbors and community members, many of whom had been avoiding eye contact with him just hours earlier. Old Martha from the diner pushed through the crowd to grasp his hands. "Jackson, I'm so sorry I didn't speak up sooner," she said, tears in her eyes. "Your farm has been the heart of this community for as long as I can remember." Others echoed her sentiments, the tide of public opinion shifting dramatically as the full implications of Horizon's deception became clear. Emma and Sarah embraced Jackson, their faces reflecting the emotional whiplash of moving from near-certain defeat to unexpected vindication. Dr. Abernathy approached with a smile. The Miller Farm Preservation Project was supposed to be announced next week, he explained. The President wanted to use it as the centerpiece for the new Rural Heritage Protection Initiative. I suppose the timeline has been accelerated somewhat. Jackson shook his head in disbelief. All this time, I was just trying to save my family's farm. I had no idea it was protecting the entire valley's water. That's precisely why your farm was selected, Robert Chen interjected, joining their conversation. It demonstrates how traditional agricultural wisdom, when combined with modern sustainable practices, often provides environmental benefits that expensive engineered solutions cannot match. When Mayor Thompson called the session back to order, his demeanor had transformed completely. Gone was the imperious figure who had begun the hearing. In his place sat a chastened public official, suddenly concerned with environmental protection and agricultural heritage. In light of the evidence presented today and the intervention of federal authorities, Thompson announced, his voice strained, all citations against Mr. Miller are hereby dismissed. Furthermore, I am directing the Town Planning Department to immediately review and correct the zoning designation of the Miller property to reflect its historic and continued agricultural use. The mayor continued, clearly reading from hastily prepared notes. The council will also be forming a special committee to review all recently approved development projects for potential environmental impacts, with particular attention to water resource protection. Jackson Miller stood as the council voted unanimously to approve these measures. The same officials who had been prepared to destroy his livelihood, now falling over themselves to demonstrate their commitment to environmental stewardship. As the formal proceedings concluded, Robert Chen approached Jackson again. "Mr. Miller, the President would like to personally visit your farm tomorrow morning, if that would be acceptable. He believes your story exemplifies exactly the kind of rural wisdom and perseverance that the nation needs to recognize and preserve." Jackson looked to his wife and daughter, their expressions mirroring his own astonishment. "The president? At our farm?" "Yes, sir," Chen confirmed with a smile. "Sometimes it takes a small-town farmer to teach Washington some big lessons about what really matters." As the Miller family made their way out of the council chambers, now surrounded by supportive neighbors rather than judgmental stares, Jackson paused to look back at the scene of his near defeat. Just hours ago, he had entered this building expecting to lose everything his family had built over generations. Now, he was preparing to welcome the President of the United States to the farm that had suddenly become a national symbol of environmental stewardship and agricultural heritage. The afternoon sun broke through the clouds as they stepped outside, illuminating the valley and the distant outline of their farm on the hillside. For the first time in months, Jackson Miller stood tall, the weight of uncertainty lifted from his shoulders. Tomorrow would bring a presidential motorcade down their dusty driveway, but more importantly, it would bring vindication for a way of life that had seemed on the verge of extinction. As they walked toward their truck, Emma squeezed her father's arm. "You always told me that doing the right thing matters, even when it's hard," she said softly. "I guess sometimes the whole world ends up seeing that too." Jackson nodded, his weathered face creasing into a smile that erased years of worry. "Your grandmother used to say that the land remembers who takes care of it," he replied, looking out over the valley their family had tended for generations. "Seems like it found a way to return the favor." Jackson Miller sat in his worn kitchen chair, the evening shadows deepening across his face as he stared at the stack of foreclosure notices and bank statements scattered across the table. The faded checkered tablecloth, a wedding gift from Sarah's mother 30 years ago, was barely visible beneath the mounting evidence of their financial desperation. Outside, the last light of day gilded his fields with false promise, the same fields that had sustained his family for generations, now threatening to slip through his fingers like the sandy loam soil after a hard rain. "We could sell the East. And parcel," Sarah suggested quietly, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had explored every possible solution and found them all wanting. She sat across from him, a cup of tea growing cold between her weathered hands. "It wouldn't be enough to clear the debt, but it might buy us some time." Jackson shook his head slowly, the lines around his eyes deepening. "That parcel contains the irrigation access point for the entire property. Without it, the rest of the farm becomes worthless." He picked up one of the bank notices, the red "Final Warning" stamp, a stark contrast to the official letterhead. "Besides, once we start selling pieces, where does it end?" Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of the screen door swinging open as Emma returned from her evening walk around the property. Their daughter's face was flushed with the particular combination of anger and determination that Jackson recognized from her childhood, the same expression she'd worn when standing up to schoolyard bullies or arguing against the closure of the town's library branch. "Professor Abernathy called," she announced, pulling out a chair and joining her parents at the table. "He's been analyzing the water samples we collected from the wellspring near the development site. Dad, the contamination is worse than we thought. The runoff from Horizon's excavation is showing high levels of industrial solvents." Jackson's calloused hand clenched around the bank notice, crumpling it slightly. "They know exactly what they're doing. That land used to belong to the old chemical plant before they shuttered in the 70s. Everyone in town knew they buried waste on that property. That's why Lawrence and his company got it so cheap," Sarah added, her normally gentle voice hardening. "No legitimate developer would touch that site without proper remediation." Emma pulled out her tablet, opening a file of photographs she'd taken earlier that day. "They've started excavating right along our property line, and they're diverting the runoff directly toward our main field. It's deliberate, Dad. They're trying to contaminate our crops so they can claim we're the ones causing the environmental hazard. The reality of their situation settled over the kitchen like a physical weight. It wasn't just about zoning violations or development progress. Horizon was systematically working to destroy the Miller farm by any means necessary, and they had the political connections and financial resources to succeed where generations of hardship had failed. "We need to take these photos to the town council," Sarah suggested, though her tone lacked conviction. They all knew Mayor Thompson was firmly in Horizon's pocket, his campaign having been primarily funded by development interests. "The council meeting tomorrow is our last chance," Jackson said finally, pushing back from the table and standing at the window. The fading light caught the silver in his hair as he looked out over the land his great-grandfather had purchased with savings from fighting in the First World War. "If they rule against us on the zoning issue, the bank will accelerate the foreclosure. We'll have 30 days to vacate." Emma moved to stand beside her father, her young face a mirror of his determination, if not his weariness. "Then we make them listen. We bring everyone we can. Professor Abernathy has agreed to testify about the water contamination, and I've reached out to some of my colleagues at the university's environmental law clinic." Jackson turned to his daughter, placing a hand on her shoulder. The same hands that had taught her to identify soil types by touch, to predict weather changes by observing cloud patterns, to plant seeds with patience and harvest with gratitude. "This isn't your fight, Emma. You've built a life for yourself, beyond this farm." "Everything I am began here," she replied with quiet certainty. "Everything I know about perseverance, integrity, sustainability, I learned it working alongside you. Of course it's my fight." Sarah joined them by the window, the three Millers looking out over their heritage as darkness settled over the valley. The distant lights of town twinkled in the gathering dusk, while the ominous silhouette of construction equipment loomed at the edge of their property, metal predators poised to devour generations of stewardship. "There's something else," Emma said hesitantly. "Several of your former students from the agricultural mentorship program have organized a community support rally before the council meeting. They've been posting about it online, and it's gaining traction." Jackson sighed heavily. The mentorship program had been his pride for over 20 years, teaching local youth about sustainable farming practices, connecting them to the land and its rhythms. The program had produced a new generation of environmentally conscious citizens, many of whom had gone on to careers in sustainable agriculture, environmental protection, and food security. Budget cuts had shuttered the program 3 years ago, another casualty of the town's shifting priorities. "I don't want this to become some kind of public spectacle," he said. "This is about our farm, our water, our right to continue a way of life that has sustained this community for generations." "It's become more than that," Sarah said softly, taking his hand. "When Horizon came to town promising economic revitalization, people were dazzled by visions of new jobs and rising property values. They didn't understand what would be lost. Your students do. They remember what you taught them about the true value of land stewardship." The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. All three exchanged puzzled glances. Visitors were rare these days, as the controversy around the farm had made the Millers something of pariahs in certain circles of the community. Sarah opened the door to find Martha Wilson standing on their porch, a covered dish in her hands and concern etched on her face. "I hope I'm not interrupting," the diner owner said, her voice carrying the distinctive local accent that was becoming increasingly rare as Willow Creek attracted more transplants from the city. "I made too much pot roast and thought you all might appreciate a home-cooked meal that you didn't have to prepare yourselves." The transparent excuse didn't mask Martha's true purpose in coming, but the Millers welcomed her warmth in the growing chill of their isolation. As she settled at their kitchen table, Martha's weathered face grew serious. "Jackson, I've been hearing things at the diner. Mayor Thompson and Victor Lawrence had breakfast there this morning, talking loud enough for anyone to hear. They're planning to make an example of you at tomorrow's council meeting. Something about using your case to establish new precedent for agricultural zoning conversion throughout the county." Jackson's expression didn't change, but his shoulders stiffened noticeably. "They want more than just our farm. They're looking to replicate this process across the valley." Martha nodded grimly. Lawrence was waving around some economic impact study claiming that converting agricultural land to mixed-use development would triple the town's tax base within 5 years. Thompson was practically salivating. "Did they happen to mention where food would come from once they've paved over all the farmland?" Emma asked, unable to mask the bitterness in her voice. "Sweetheart, people like that don't think about where their food comes from," Martha replied sadly. "They see it appearing in grocery stores and restaurants as if by magic, with no connection to the land or the hands that nurture it." They spoke late into the evening, Martha sharing what intelligence she had gathered from her position as owner of the town's most popular gathering spot. The diner had become an unofficial community hub where conversations between officials, developers, and citizens created a tapestry of information for those attentive enough to piece it together. As Martha prepared to leave, she hesitated at the door. "There's one more thing. A strange fellow came into the diner this afternoon, asking all sorts of questions about your farm. Didn't look like a developer type. More official somehow. Dark suit, very polite but intense. Said he was conducting research on agricultural sustainability in rural communities." Jackson and Sarah exchanged puzzled glances. "Did he leave?" "A name or contact information?" Sarah asked. Martha shook her head. "Just paid for his coffee and pie, left a generous tip, and thanked me for my time. But he was taking notes the whole time I was talking about your organic farming methods and the community programs you've run over the years." After Martha left, the Millers returned to their kitchen table, the implications of everything they'd learned settling over them like the evening fog that was beginning to creep through the valley. The stack of financial documents seemed even more ominous in light of the coordinated effort to drive them from their land. "We should try to get some rest," Sarah finally suggested, though rest seemed an unlikely prospect, with the council meeting looming just hours away. "Whatever happens tomorrow, we'll face it together, as this family always has." That night, Jackson found himself unable to sleep. Shortly after midnight, he pulled on his boots and jacket and slipped outside. The night air carried the particular crispness of early spring, promising warmth to come, but still holding the memory of winter's chill. A nearly full moon illuminated the farmyard, casting long shadows from the barn and silo that had stood sentinel over the property for over a century. Jackson walked the boundaries of his farm as he had countless times before, his feet finding the familiar paths even in the darkness. He paused at the eastern edge of the property, where Horizon's construction vehicles loomed like mechanical beasts, their metal hides gleaming dully in the moonlight. Just beyond the property line, fresh excavation revealed the raw earth unnaturally, exposed and vulnerable. He continued his circuit, moving from field to field, mentally cataloguing the plantings that should be beginning, the maintenance that needed attention, the eternal cycle of agricultural life that had defined his existence since childhood. When he reached the natural spring that fed their irrigation system, he knelt and plunged his hands into the cold water, feeling its movement against his skin. This was what the developers would never understand, the intimate connection between farmer and land, the sacred trust of stewardship that passed from generation to generation. To them, this property was merely square footage and potential profit margins. To Jackson, it was a living entity with which his family had formed a covenant of mutual care. As he made his way back toward the farmhouse, a movement at the edge of the property caught his attention. Tensing, he moved quietly toward the disturbance, expecting to find trespassers from the construction site. Instead, he discovered two figures taking soil and water samples, working with the practiced efficiency of environmental scientists. "This is private property," Jackson called out, his voice carrying in the night stillness. The figures straightened, one of them raising a hand in greeting rather than alarm. "Mr. Miller, I apologize for the intrusion. I'm Agent Marshall with the EPA, and this is my colleague, Dr. Patel. We're conducting independent testing as part of an ongoing federal investigation." Jackson approached cautiously, skepticism evident in his stance. "The EPA hasn't been particularly responsive to our concerns about Horizon's development practices. Why the sudden interest in the middle of the night?" Agent Marshall's expression remained professional, but a hint of sympathy showed in his eyes. "Sir, I can't discuss the details of our investigation, but I can tell you that concerns about this development have reached federal levels. We're collecting evidence independently to avoid any interference from local officials or the development in company." Dr. Patel, a woman in her 50s with an air of academic authority, added, "Mr. Miller, your sustainable farming practices have created a unique microenvironment that serves as an effective indicator of contamination in the watershed. The contrast between your soil composition and that of the surrounding properties provides valuable comparative data." "You're using my farm as a control group," Jackson realized, understanding dawning. "In a manner of speaking," Dr. Patel confirmed. "Your organic methods have maintained soil integrity that most conventional farms lack. It allows us to clearly identify contaminant intrusion and track its progression." Jackson stood silently for a moment, absorbing this information. "Will any of this help stop the development or save my farm?" Agent Marshall's hesitation spoke volumes. "Our investigation focuses on federal environmental violations, not local zoning disputes. However, if we identify significant contamination or Clean Water Act violations, it could certainly impact Horizon's ability to proceed with construction." "But not in time for tomorrow's council meeting," Jackson concluded. "I'm afraid not, sir. These tests take time to process, and our investigation must follow proper protocols." The agent's professional demeanor softened slightly. "For what it's worth, Mr. Miller, there are people in Washington who are paying close attention to what's happening here in Willow Creek. Your situation may represent a critical test case for rural land use policy moving forward." Jackson nodded. Grimly, the knowledge that federal authorities were investigating provided cold comfort in the face of tomorrow's more immediate threat. After the EPA officials departed with their samples, he returned to the farmhouse, where he found Sarah waiting for him in the kitchen, a cup of tea steaming before her. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked, settling into the chair across from her. She shook her head, reaching across the table to take his hand. "I keep thinking about the day we took over the farm from your parents. Remember how terrified we were? 2 kids in their 20s, suddenly responsible for all this history, all this legacy." Jackson smiled at the memory. "Dad handed me his old ledger book like he was passing on the family Bible, said, 'The numbers never tell the whole story, son. Remember that when times get hard.'" "And they have gotten hard before," Sarah reminded him gently. "The drought of '98, the blight in 2003, the market crash of 2008. We survived." "This is different," Jackson said, his voice low. "Those were natural challenges or economic cycles. This is deliberate, people with power and money systematically working to erase our way of life because it stands in the way of their profits." Sarah's grip on his hand tightened. "Then we fight with everything we have." not just for ourselves, but for what this farm represents. A different vision of progress, one that honors the past while sustaining the future. As the first hint of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, the Millers prepared for the battle ahead. Emma joined them for a silent breakfast, the three communicating more through glances and gestures than words, bound by shared purpose and the unspoken acknowledgement that by day's end their world might be irrevocably changed. They were surprised to find Peter Donnelly, their elderly attorney, waiting on their porch when they emerged to drive into town. The old lawyer's face showed the strain of a sleepless night, but his eyes burned with determined focus. "I've been reviewing town records dating back to the original land grants," he announced, without preamble. "The zoning change in 1992 was procedurally flawed. They failed to provide proper notice to property owners and never recorded the final maps with the county as required by state law." A flicker of hope kindled in Jackson's chest. "What does that mean for us legally?" "It means the residential zoning designation they're using against you may be invalid," Donnelly explained, his voice gaining strength. "The original agricultural zoning might still be the legally enforceable designation." Emma's face lit up. "So they can't claim we're violating residential zoning restrictions if those restrictions were never properly enacted?" "Precisely," Donnelly confirmed, allowing himself a small smile. "It's a technical argument, but sometimes technicalities are all we have in the face of power and influence." And as they drove toward town, they were startled to see the growing crowd assembling outside the municipal building. What had begun as a small gathering of Jackson's former students had swelled to include dozens of community members, farmers from neighboring properties, customers who had purchased Miller produce for decades, parents whose children had participated in the farm's educational programs. Many carried hand-painted signs: "Save Miller Farm," "Food Not Condos," "Protect Our Water," and perhaps most touching to Jackson, "We Stand with the Land." The multi-generational crowd represented a cross-section of Willow Creek's population, from elderly residents who remembered Jackson's father working the same fields, to young families concerned about the community's future. As the Millers approached, a spontaneous cheer rose from the gathered supporters. Jackson felt his throat tighten with emotion at this unexpected demonstration of solidarity after months of isolation and judgment. Emma squeezed his arm, her eyes bright with unshed tears at this validation of her father's impact on the community. Inside the municipal building, the mood was tense. Town employees moved with heightened alertness, and several unfamiliar security personnel monitored the entrances. The council chambers were already filled to capacity, with the overflow crowd watching on monitors set up in the building's lobby. Victor Lawrence sat with his legal team, their tailored suits and leather portfolios projecting corporate confidence. The Horizon director studiously avoided looking at the Miller family as they made their way to the respondents' table, but the slight tightening of his jaw betrayed his awareness of their presence. Mayor Thompson entered from a side door, followed by the council members. The mayor's typical swagger seemed somewhat diminished, his eyes darting nervously around the chamber as he registered the unprecedented public turnout and the unusual security presence. As the proceedings began, Jackson noticed something odd. Two of the suited men he had encountered during his nighttime walk were positioned near the chamber doors, their alert posture suggesting they were monitoring the proceedings with professional interest. A third unfamiliar figure sat in the back row, his attention focused not on the council but on the interactions between Mayor Thompson and the Horizon representatives. The council moved efficiently through procedural matters before reaching the Miller farm case. When Mayor Thompson called Jackson's name, the chamber fell silent. The collective attention of the community focused on the farmer as he rose to face the council. Jackson straightened to his full height, drawing strength from the generations of millers who had worked the land before him and the family members who flanked him now. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of a man who had spent a lifetime in harmony with natural cycles greater than human machinations. "Before these proceedings continue," he began, "my attorney has identified a significant legal issue that must be addressed." Peter Donnelly rose, presenting his findings about the flawed zoning process with the precision of a man who had spent decades navigating the intricacies of municipal law. As he methodically outlined the procedural failures, Jackson observed the town attorney's increasingly troubled expression. The legal technicality had clearly caught them unprepared. Mayor Thompson attempted to dismiss the concern. "These historical procedural matters can be addressed separately. The issue before us today is Mr. Miller's current violations." "With respect, Mr. Mayor," Donnelly countered, his frail appearance belied by the strength in his voice, "if the zoning designation itself is invalid, there can be no violation. I've prepared a motion to stay these proceedings pending judicial review of the 1992 zoning map's legal status." The mayor conferred hurriedly with the town attorney, their whispered exchange growing increasingly heated as the attorney apparently confirmed Donnelly's legal assessment. The council members exchanged uncertain glances, clearly unprepared for this development. Victor Lawrence rose smoothly, his corporate confidence unshaken. "Mr. Mayor, council members, while these arcane legal matters are being sorted out, Horizon Development continues to incur significant costs due to the delays and obstructions caused by Mr. Miller. Our investors are growing concerned about the timeline for Willow Creek Commons, and the promised economic benefits to the community remain unrealized." Lawrence's implied threat was clear. The town's eagerly anticipated development windfall hung in the balance. Mayor Thompson nodded in understanding, visibly calculating political costs against legal realities. "Perhaps," Lawrence continued, his voice taking on a reasonable tone that immediately put Jackson on alert, "we could reach a compromise solution. Horizon would be willing to purchase the Miller property at a premium price, say 150% of assessed value. This would allow Mr. Miller to relocate his farming operation to a more appropriately zoned location while allowing our development to proceed on schedule." The offer hung in the air, its superficial generosity masking the reality that no amount of money could replicate 5 generations of soil cultivation or the intricate ecosystem that had developed on the Miller farm. The assessed value, moreover, reflected only the property's residential potential, not its agricultural heritage or environmental significance. Before Jackson could respond, Emma stood, her scientific training evident in her precise, measured tone. "Council members, I'd like to present evidence regarding the environmental impact of Horizon's current construction activities on my family's farm and the broader watershed." She activated a presentation on the chamber's display screen, methodically, walking the council through water and soil test results that documented increasing contamination levels since Horizon began excavation. Her academic credentials lent weight to the data as she explained the potential long-term consequences for the regional water supply. "This isn't just about one farm," she concluded. "The Miller property serves as a critical natural filter for the watershed that supplies drinking water to over 15,000 people in 3 communities. Replacing this natural system with impermeable surfaces and underground structures will have consequences far beyond Willow Creek's borders." As Emma concluded her presentation, a commotion at the back of the chamber drew everyone's attention. The doors opened to admit Dr. James Abernathy, followed by a small team of researchers carrying scientific equipment and documentation. The professor made his way down the center aisle with the quiet authority of academic distinction. "Mr. Mayor," he called out, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent chamber, "I believe the council should hear critical scientific evidence before making any decision that could irreparably harm this region's water security." The tension in the council chambers crystallized as Dr. James Abernathy approached the podium, his academic bearing commanding immediate respect even from those who had come prepared to dismiss the miller's concerns. The professor placed a thick binder of documentation before him, adjusting his glasses with the practiced motion of someone accustomed to presenting complex data to skeptical audiences. "Ladies and gentlemen of the council," he began, his voice carrying the measured cadence of decades in lecture halls, "I appear before you today not as an advocate, but as a scientist compelled by evidence. What we have discovered about the Willow Creek watershed represents findings of such significance that I would be professionally negligent to remain silent." Mayor Thompson shifted uncomfortably, his political instincts clearly at war with his desire to maintain control of the proceedings. "Dr. Abernathy, while we appreciate your expertise, this hearing has a specific purpose and timeline." "I understand completely, Mr. Mayor," the professor interrupted smoothly. "I wouldn't dream of wasting this council's valuable time. What I present today directly impacts any decision regarding the Miller property and the adjacent development." He gestured to his team, who had begun setting up a sophisticated topographical display. As the team worked, one of the suited men at the back of the room moved forward slightly, his attention now fully focused on the proceedings. Jackson noticed his quiet communication with someone via an earpiece, the man's expression remaining professionally neutral despite the rising tension in the chamber. Dr. Abernathy activated the display, revealing a three-dimensional hydrological map of the Willow Creek Valley. "For the past 3 years, my research team has been conducting the most comprehensive study of rural watershed dynamics ever attempted in this region. What you're seeing is a real-time model of underground water movement throughout the valley. The display showed a complex network of blue lines flowing beneath the surface topography, converging at several critical points before forming larger channels that fed into the regional water system. One of the major convergence points pulsed with light directly beneath the Miller farm. This is not speculative modeling," Dr. Abernathy continued, "but data-driven mapping verified through thousands of soil samples, ground-penetrating radar, and isotope tracking. What we've discovered is that the Miller property sits atop what we call a hydrological keystone, a critical juncture where multiple underground streams converge before feeding into the aquifer that supplies water to 3 counties. Victor Lawrence rose, his corporate patience visibly wearing thin. "Mr. Mayor, while this science lesson is fascinating, it has no bearing on the zoning issues at hand. The watershed management is accounted for in our environmental impact statements and development plans." Dr. Abernathy turned toward the developer, his academic demeanor giving way to a more direct challenge. "Actually, Mr. Lawrence, your environmental impact statement makes no mention of the underground spring network that our research has documented. In fact, it explicitly states that no significant underground water features exist on or adjacent to the development site, a claim our data conclusively disproves." The professor returned to his display, zooming in on the area where Horizon's excavation had begun. "What's particularly concerning is the impact your current construction is already having on the watershed. These red indicators show contamination, levels that have increased by 78% since excavation began 3 months ago." Michael Turner, the former Horizon environmental consultant, stepped forward with additional documentation. "I attempted to include this spring network in my original assessment, but was instructed to remove it from my report." He activated his own presentation, displaying internal Horizon emails that clearly showed Lawrence ordering the removal of all references to underground water features. The council chambers erupted in murmurs as citizens processed the implications of this revelation. Mayor Thompson gavelled for order, his face flushing as he struggled to maintain control of the proceedings that were rapidly spiraling beyond his management. "These are serious allegations," Thompson admitted reluctantly, "but they would need to be addressed in a separate environmental hearing. Today's agenda item concerns zoning compliance, not water quality." At this point, the suited man who had been observing from the back stepped forward. "Mr. Mayor, if I may." His voice carried the unmistakable authority of federal credentials. "I'm Special Agent David Marshall with the Environmental Protection Agency's Criminal Investigation Division. The evidence being presented here directly pertains to potential violations of the Clean Water Act and Safe Drinking Water Act, which would supersede local zoning considerations." A stunned silence fell over the chamber as Agent Marshall continued. "Based on Dr. Abernathy's research and corroborating evidence gathered by EPA field agents, we have been conducting an investigation into potential criminal negligence regarding the Willow Creek Commons development's impact on regional water security." Victor Lawrence's corporate composure finally cracked. "This is preposterous. Our company has complied with all applicable regulations. If there are concerns about water quality, they should be addressed through proper channels, not through this ambush in a local zoning hearing." "I couldn't agree more about proper channels, Mr. Lawrence," Agent Marshall replied evenly. "Which is why I'm serving Horizon Development with this federal order to cease all construction activities pending completion of our investigation." He handed official documents to a visibly shaken Lawrence, whose face had drained of color. Mayor Thompson, now ashen-faced himself, struggled to process this dramatic turn of events. "Agent Marshall, while we certainly respect federal authority, the town of Willow Creek has followed all required procedures in approving this development." "I understand, Mr. Mayor," Marshall interrupted gently but firmly. "At this time, we're not making any determinations regarding the town's approval process. Our focus is specifically on the environmental impact and potential violations of federal law. However," he added, his gaze sweeping the council bench, "our investigation will necessarily include a review of all relevant decision-making processes." The implied threat of examining the town's approval process and potentially exposing any improper influence hung in the air like a thundercloud. Council members exchanged nervous glances, suddenly aware that their own actions might now face federal scrutiny. In the gallery, Martha Wilson leaned toward her neighbor, whispering just loudly enough for those nearby to hear, "Didn't I tell you Thompson's campaign was funded almost entirely by development money? Might be time for those campaign finance reports to see the light of day." The second suited man, who had been stationed near the door, now approached the council bench, introducing himself as Robert Chen, Special Advisor to the President on Rural Affairs. "Mr. Mayor, council members, the White House has been monitoring the situation in Willow Creek with great interest. The President believes that communities like yours represent a critical balance point between development and preservation of our agricultural heritage." The revelation that this small-town zoning dispute had attracted presidential attention sent another shockwave through the chamber. Jackson felt Emma grip his arm in astonishment, while Sarah pressed her hand to her mouth, overwhelmed by the sudden reversal of their fortunes. Chen continued, his tone both diplomatic and authoritative. "The Rural Heritage Protection Initiative, which the President will be announcing next week, uses Willow Creek as a case study in how traditional agricultural practices can serve essential environmental functions while maintaining food security and cultural continuity." He turned toward Jackson, addressing him directly for the first time. "Mr. Miller, Your farm's organic practices and water management techniques have created what our scientists call a regenerative environmental system. Essentially, a working farm that simultaneously functions as natural water filtration, carbon sequestration, and biodiversity preservation. The President believes such properties represent national assets worthy of federal protection. Jackson Miller sat stunned, struggling to reconcile his months of seemingly hopeless battle against powerful interests with this sudden validation from the highest levels of government. For generations, his family had simply farmed according to principles of stewardship and sustainability, never imagining their practices would one day be recognized as models for national policy. Mayor Thompson, political survivor that he was, recognized the shifting winds immediately. With remarkable agility, he transformed from developer advocate to environmental champion before the assembled citizens' eyes. This council has always prioritized the unique environmental and agricultural character of our community, he declared, ignoring the skeptical murmurs from the gallery. We welcome federal interest in preserving Willow Creek's natural resources. Victor Lawrence, however, was not willing to concede so easily. This is government overreach, plain and simple, he protested, regaining some of his corporate confidence. Horizon Development has valid contracts and permits that cannot be arbitrarily revoked without due process and just compensation. Your permits were obtained through fraudulent environmental impact statements, Mr. Lawrence, Michael Turner countered, displaying more internal documents. These emails show that you were fully aware of the underground spring network and soil contamination issues, but deliberately concealed this information from town officials and regulatory agencies. Lawrence's attorney urgently whispered in his ear, clearly advising him to remain silent as the evidence of potential criminal liability mounted. The developer's face darkened with suppressed rage, but he heeded his lawyer's counsel and sat down abruptly. Dr. Abernathy returned to his presentation, now focusing on the unique properties of the Miller farm that had drawn federal attention. What makes this property particularly valuable from an environmental perspective is how 5 generations of organic farming practices have enhanced, rather than depleted, the natural filtration capabilities of the soil. The professor displayed side-by-side soil samples from the Miller farm and adjacent properties. The soil composition on the Miller property shows remarkably higher microbial diversity and carbon capture capacity. Essentially, the farm functions as a living filter for the watershed, removing contaminants and improving water quality naturally. Emma Miller rose to join the professor at the display, her academic training allowing her to elaborate on the scientific significance. What my family has always called good farming practices turns out to be creating what scientists now term ecosystem services. Natural processes that would cost millions to replicate through engineered solutions. She turned to face the council directly, her voice gaining strength. When my great-grandfather planted our first cover crops and implemented crop rotation in the 1930s, he wasn't thinking about watershed management or carbon sequestration. He was just being a good steward of the land. 5 generations of those practices have created a natural environmental protection system that works precisely because it wasn't designed just to make money, but to sustain life. The wisdom in her words resonated through the chamber, shifting the perspective of many who had viewed the Miller farm as merely an obstacle to progress. Now they began to see it as something more profound, a living testament to an alternative vision of progress, one measured not in quarterly profits but in generational sustainability. Jackson Miller finally rose to address the council, his weathered face reflecting both the hardship of recent months and the dignity of a man who had never wavered in his principles. His voice, when he spoke, carried the authentic authority of someone whose hands had worked the soil he defended. "I've never been one for big speeches or political fights," he began, his gaze sweeping across faces he had known all his life. "My family has always believed that actions speak louder than words, and the best argument for our way of life is the health of our land and the quality of what it produces." He gestured toward the scientific displays and federal orders that had transformed what was supposed to be his farm's death sentence into an unexpected reprieve. "I'm grateful for the science that has validated what generations of farmers have known through observation and experience. I'm grateful for the federal authorities who have enforced laws designed to protect our common resources." Jackson paused, looking directly at Mayor Thompson and the council members. "But I'm most grateful for the lesson this teaches all of us about what truly matters in a community. It's not the tax base or property values that ultimately determine our quality of life. It's the health of our soil, the purity of our water, the integrity of our food supply, and the wisdom to protect these things for future generations." The simple eloquence of the farmer's words cut through the technical and legal complexity that had dominated the proceedings. Throughout the chamber, heads nodded in recognition of a truth that transcended political positions and economic interests. "I don't oppose development or progress," Jackson continued, "but true progress enhances what's valuable rather than destroying it. For too long, we've measured success only in economic terms, forgetting that economics is meant to serve human well-being, not the other way around." As Jackson concluded his remarks, a spontaneous applause broke out in the gallery, spreading until even some council members joined in acknowledgement of the wisdom in his words. Mayor Thompson, reading the room with political acumen, seized the opportunity to align himself with the prevailing sentiment. In light of the compelling evidence presented today and the intervention of federal authorities, Thompson announced with newly discovered environmental conviction, "I move that this council immediately rescind all citations against Mr. Miller and direct the planning department to correct the zoning designation of the Miller property to properly reflect its agricultural use." The motion passed unanimously, council members eager to distance themselves from the increasingly toxic horizon development. Thompson further moved to establish a Willow Creek agricultural heritage zone to protect similar properties from inappropriate development pressure, a proposal that would have seemed inconceivable just hours earlier. As the formal proceedings concluded, Agent Marshall approached Jackson with a smile that softened his official demeanor. "Mr. Miller, I've been instructed to inform you that the President would like to personally visit your farm tomorrow morning. He believes your story exemplifies the balance between tradition and innovation that will be central to the Rural Heritage Protection Initiative." Jackson exchanged astonished glances with Sarah and Emma, the concept of a presidential visit to their modest farm beyond anything they could have imagined when they rose that morning. "The President at our farm?" "Yes, sir," Chen confirmed, joining them. "Your property will be designated as the first protected site under the new initiative. The President feels that seeing sustainable agricultural practices firsthand will help communicate the program's importance better than any policy paper could." As the Miller family made their way through the crowd of well-wishers and supporters that had gathered around them, Jackson found himself shaking more hands and receiving more backslaps than he had in years. Community members who had kept their distance during the controversy now approached with congratulations and relief that the farm would continue its century-long tradition. Old Martha Wilson pushed through the crowd to embrace Sarah. "I never doubted for a minute," she declared, though all of them knew that wasn't entirely true. "Just wait till the whole country sees what we've known all along, that the Miller farm is something special worth preserving." Outside the municipal building, the spring sunshine seemed brighter somehow, illuminating the valley and the distant hills where generations of farmers had worked in harmony with natural cycles. Jackson breathed deeply. the weight of months of struggle lifting from his shoulders like morning mist burned away by the rising sun. Emma linked her arm through her father's as they walked toward their truck. "You always taught me that doing. The right thing matters, even when it's hard," she said softly. "And I guess sometimes the world catches up to what's right, even if it takes a while." Jackson nodded, his weathered face creasing into a smile that erased years of worry. "Your grandmother used to say that if you take care of the land takes care of you," he replied, looking out over the valley their family had tended for generations. "Seems like it found a way to keep its end of the bargain." As they drove home to prepare for the unprecedented day that would follow, Jackson found himself reflecting on the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. What had begun as a simple desire to continue farming as his family always had, evolved into a decisive battle over competing visions of progress and prosperity. The farm that had seemed doomed to become a legal casualty of development had instead become a national symbol of sustainable stewardship. The practices his family had followed out of inherited wisdom and respect for the land had been validated by the highest levels of scientific and governmental authority. Pulling into their gravel driveway, Jackson noticed how differently he saw the familiar landscape now. The fields waiting for spring planting, the old barn that needed a fresh coat of paint, the wellspring that had watered generations of crops, all of these now carried not just personal significance, but newly recognized public value. Sarah squeezed his hand as they sat in the truck, taking a moment to absorb everything that had happened. "I keep thinking about what your father told us when we took over the farm," she said softly. "You're not just growing crops," he said. "You're growing tomorrow." Jackson nodded, the wisdom of those words deepening with time. "I never imagined our tomorrow would include a presidential visit," he replied with a slight chuckle, "or that our little farm would become part of national policy." Emma, always the practical one, was already making notes on her tablet. "We should show him the watershed integration system first," she suggested, "then the heirloom seed preservation program, and definitely the student educational plots." Jackson and Sarah exchanged amused glances at their daughter's immediate shift to planning mode. Some things never changed, even when everything else did. The Miller family resilience that had weathered droughts, floods, economic downturns, and, now, corporate development threats remained their greatest inherited strength. As they stepped out of the truck, Jackson noticed several black SUVs parked discreetly at the end of their driveway. Advanced security preparing for tomorrow's presidential visit. The sight brought home the reality of their changed circumstances in a way that even the dramatic council meeting hadn't. "Do you think they'll want us to change anything?" Sarah wondered, surveying their modest farmhouse with sudden concern for its appearance. "If the president wants to see a real working farm, then that's exactly what we'll show him," Jackson replied firmly. "Mud on the porch steps, tools in the yard and all. This isn't a movie set. It's a living piece of American agricultural heritage." As the evening approached, neighbors began arriving with food, offers of help and congratulations. The farmhouse kitchen that had recently been the site of worried financial discussions now hummed with community energy and renewed purpose. The isolation that had surrounded the Millers during their months of struggle dissolved in the warmth of restored connections. Looking around at the gathering of friends and neighbors, Jackson realized that they were celebrating more than just the salvation of one farm. They were recognizing the preservation of something more fundamental, a way of life that honored the reciprocal relationship between people and the land that sustained them. Later that night, as the visitors departed and quiet settled over the farm, Jackson took one last walk around the property. The spring air carried the earthy scent of soil warming after winter's chill, promising renewal and growth in the season ahead. Security personnel nodded respectfully as he passed, no longer seeing him as just a stubborn old farmer, but as someone whose life's work had earned presidential recognition. Standing at the highest point of his property, Jackson looked out over the patchwork of fields illuminated by moonlight. Each plot held memories of lessons learned, challenges overcome, and wisdom gained through direct engagement with natural systems. What modern developers saw as inefficient or obsolete, he recognized as time-tested knowledge essential for a sustainable future. In the distance, the lights of Willow Creek twinkled, the town that had nearly allowed his family legacy to be bulldozed, now preparing to welcome the President of the United States to celebrate that very heritage. The irony wasn't lost on Jackson, but neither was the profound lesson in how quickly perspectives could shift when hidden values were suddenly made visible. Jackson Miller had never sought recognition or fame, like generations of farmers before. He had simply tried to be a good steward of the land entrusted to his care. That this quiet stewardship had now captured national attention spoke to a hunger for authenticity and sustainability in a world increasingly disconnected from its agricultural roots. As he made his way back to the farmhouse where Sarah waited, on the porch, Jackson felt a deep sense of peace settling over him. Whatever tomorrow might bring, cameras, officials, even a presidential handshake, the true value of their farm remained in the healthy soil beneath his feet, the clean water flowing through their springs, and the living knowledge passed from one generation to the next. The presidential motorcade that would arrive the next day represented more than political acknowledgement. It symbolized a national awakening to truths that farmers like Jackson had understood all along, that caring for the land wasn't just about preserving the past, but about securing the future. In the quiet of that spring night, under stars that had witnessed the labors of his ancestors, Jackson Miller's heart filled with gratitude for the unexpected turn of events that had transformed his family's darkest hour into a beacon of hope for rural communities everywhere. Tomorrow would bring a new chapter in the Miller farm's long history, one that would connect their small corner of the world to the larger story of America's evolving relationship with its agricultural heritage. Dawn broke over the Miller farm, with a golden clarity that seemed symbolic of the day ahead. Jackson had been awake for hours, his farmer's habits unaltered by the extraordinary circumstances about to unfold. He stood on his porch, steaming coffee mug in hand, watching as Secret Service agents completed their security sweep of the property. The sight of earpiece-wearing personnel checking his barn and outbuildings created a surreal contrast against the timeless backdrop of fields and sky. Sarah joined him, wrapping a cardigan around her shoulders against the morning chill. "I still can't quite believe it," she said, leaning against his arm. "Yesterday we were fighting for closure, and today the president is coming to our farm." Jackson nodded, his weathered face thoughtful. "Life has a way of surprising you when you've run out of hope, but not determination." He gazed at the eastern fields where the first green shoots of early crops were emerging from the rich soil. "Whatever happens today, we need to remember what matters. This isn't about us, it's about what this land represents." The sound of vehicles approaching drew their attention. Rather than the presidential motorcade, which wasn't expected for several hours, a convoy of media trucks turned onto their gravel driveway. Within minutes, reporters and camera crews began setting up equipment, transforming the quiet farmyard into an impromptu broadcast center. Emma emerged from the house, her hair still damp from the shower, eyes widening at the media presence. "I counted 7 different network logos," she reported, "and there's a satellite truck from the national news." A young woman in a crisp pantsuit approached, extending her hand. "Mr. Miller, I'm Alexis Chen from the White House press office. We'll be managing the media for today's presidential visit." She glanced at her tablet. "The president's schedule includes a tour of your farming operation, with particular focus on your water conservation techniques and organic practices." He'll then make remarks announcing the Rural Heritage Protection Initiative, using your farm as the backdrop. The press liaison continued, her efficiency both impressive and slightly overwhelming. We'd like to position the president at the crest of the hill, overlooking both your fields and the controversial development site for maximum visual impact. Our advanced team suggests having some of your traditional farming implements visible, but not obtrusive. Jackson exchanged a glance with Sarah, both of them recognizing how their personal struggle was being transformed into political theater. "Ms. Chen," he said carefully, "we're happy to welcome the president, but we want this visit to be authentic. This is a working farm, not a movie set." Alexis smiled with practiced diplomacy. "Of course, Mr. Miller. The president specifically requested authenticity. He wants to see the real operations that make your farm environmentally significant." She lowered her voice slightly. "Between us, he was quite impressed by the soil composition analysis from Dr. Abernathy's team. He has a personal interest in regenerative agriculture. As the morning progressed, the farm became increasingly busy. Local officials arrived, eager to associate themselves with the suddenly celebrated Miller property. Mayor Thompson appeared, his political instincts having fully embraced his new role as champion of agricultural preservation. "Jackson!" he called with forced familiarity. "I've brought the council members to personally congratulate you on this well-deserved recognition." The mayor extended his hand, as if they had been allies all along, rather than adversaries, just 24 hours earlier. Jackson accepted the handshake with dignified reserve. "Thank you, Richard. I trust the council will show the same enthusiasm for protecting other family farms in our valley." The mayor's smile flickered briefly before he recovered. "Absolutely. In fact, I'm proposing a comprehensive agricultural heritage zone that would prevent any similar conflicts in the future." He lowered his voice conspiratorially. "Between us, the Horizon Development contract is being thoroughly reviewed in light of the environmental concerns." As the mayor moved away to position himself advantageously for the cameras, Martha Wilson approached, carrying an enormous basket. "Thought you might need some sustenance with all this commotion," she said, revealing homemade sandwiches, fruit, and cookies. "My goodness, Jackson, I haven't seen this many people at your farm since the Harvest Festival of '98. Martha's straightforward warmth was a welcome relief from the political posturing. "The diner's been packed since dawn," she continued, "everyone talking about the presidential visit and what it means for Willow Creek. Even old Frank Jenkins, who signed that petition against your farm last year, was saying he always knew there was something special about your place." Jackson smiled at the community's rapid realignment. Human nature was predictable that way. Everyone wanted to be on the winning side of history. He couldn't find it in himself to resent the sudden support, recognizing that today's events might protect not just his farm, but others throughout the region. By mid-morning, Dr. Abernathy and his research team had arrived, setting up displays, explaining the scientific significance of the Miller Farm's watershed contribution. The professor moved through the growing crowd with academic purpose, correcting misconceptions and ensuring that the environmental science would be accurately represented. "Jackson," he called, spotting the farmer checking irrigation lines, "I wanted to show you something remarkable." He opened his tablet to display a comparison of soil samples. "This is standard agricultural soil from conventional farms in the region. And this," he swiped to another image, "is soil from your eastern field. The microbial diversity is astounding, almost 3 times the typical levels." The professor's enthusiasm was genuine and infectious. "What your family has achieved through organic practices isn't just sustainable agriculture. It's actually regenerative. You're not merely preserving the soil quality you inherited, you're improving it with each generation." For Jackson, This scientific validation of practices handed down through his family brought a deeper satisfaction than any political recognition. His great-grandfather hadn't had soil composition analysis or watershed mapping. He had simply observed that certain practices improved yields while maintaining the land's vitality. That intuitive wisdom, passed from father to son for generations, now stood validated by the highest levels of modern science. As noon approached, the Secret Service presence intensified. Agent Marshall, now in his formal capacity rather than the undercover role of the previous day, briefed the Miller family on protocol for the presidential meeting. "The motorcade will arrive at approximately 12:30, he explained. "You'll greet the president here by the main house, then lead him on the tour you've planned. He's allocated 45 minutes for the private tour before the public remarks and media portion." Emma had been busy organizing their most significant areas to showcase. "We'll start with the spring-fed irrigation system," she said, "then move to the heritage seed preservation project, the composting operation, and finish at the hilltop for the broader watershed view." Throughout the morning, neighbors and community members continued to arrive, many bringing food, offers of help, or simply their congratulations. Children from the local schools had been bussed in, carrying hand-painted signs celebrating the Miller farm. The gathering had spontaneously evolved into something between a community celebration and an agricultural education event. Peter Donnelly, the elderly attorney who had found the zoning technicality that began their legal victory, sat in a folding chair under the shade of an old oak tree, accepting congratulations from fellow citizens with modest dignity. Nearby, Michael Turner, the whistleblower whose evidence had exposed Horizon's environmental deception, was deep in conversation with a group of university students about corporate accountability and ethical responsibility. At precisely 12:25, the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors announced the approach of Marine One, the presidential helicopter that had been chosen over a motorcade for logistical reasons. The crowd's energy immediately shifted, conversation dying away as all eyes turned skyward. The green and white helicopter appeared over the eastern tree line, circling once before settling in the designated landing area in the southern pasture. The Miller family stood together at the appointed greeting spot, years of hard work and rural dignity evident in their posture and expressions. Jackson had politely declined the press officer's suggestion that he wear something more formal than his usual work clothes. "The president wants to meet a farmer," he had said firmly, "so he'll meet me as I am every day." His clean but well-worn flannel shirt and work pants represented an authenticity that no carefully selected outfit could match. As the president descended from the helicopter and made his way across the field, Jackson was struck by how ordinary the moment felt, despite its extraordinary nature. After generations of Millers had worked this land in quiet obscurity, the highest office in the land was coming to acknowledge their stewardship. Yet the significance lay not in the political power approaching them, but in the validation of principles that had guided their family long before this presidency and would continue long after it ended. The president reached them with an extended hand and a warm smile that seemed genuine rather than practiced. "Mr. Miller," he said, his voice carrying the familiar cadence that Americans heard on television, but now directed personally at Jackson. "I've been looking forward to meeting the farmer who reminded Washington about the true meaning of sustainability." The handshake was firm, the president's eyes engaged and attentive as Jackson introduced Sarah and Emma. "Thank you for coming into our farm, Mr. President," Jackson replied. "We're honored to show you what 5 generations of Millers have built here." What followed was unlike any presidential event the media had witnessed. Rather than a carefully choreographed photo opportunity, the tour became a genuine conversation between a curious president and a knowledgeable farming family. As they moved through the property, Jackson explained their water conservation techniques, while Emma detailed the scientific principles behind their organic pest management strategies. The president asked thoughtful questions that revealed a sincere interest in agricultural sustainability. At the Heritage Seed Bank, he spent nearly 15 minutes discussing biodiversity and food security with Emma, taking notes as she explained how heirloom varieties offer genetic resilience against climate change and disease. "What impresses me most about your operation," the president commented as they examined the composting system, "is how you've integrated traditional knowledge with scientific understanding. You're not clinging to the past for nostalgia's sake, but using time-tested methods that modern science is now validating." At the natural spring that fed the farm's irrigation system, the president crouched down to examine the crystal-clear water emerging from the earth. "This is what we're fighting to protect," he said, more to himself than the others. "Not just the water itself, but the natural systems that purify it." As they reached the hilltop for the final portion of the tour, the president paused to take in the expansive view. From this vantage point, the Miller farm's carefully maintained fields presented a stark contrast to the partially excavated Horizon development site visible in the distance. "This visual tells the story better than any policy paper could," he remarked. "On one side, generations of sustainable stewardship. On the other, short-term profit that nearly destroyed an irreplaceable resource." Turning to Jackson, the president's expression became more serious. "Mr. Miller, what your family has preserved here isn't just a farm. It's a model for how agriculture can work in harmony with natural systems rather than against them. The Rural Heritage Protection Initiative aims to recognize and support operations like yours throughout the country." The afternoon sun illuminated the valley as they made their way back toward the main gathering area where the crowd and media waited. Walking slightly ahead with Emma, the president asked about her research at the university and her plans to integrate scientific knowledge with traditional farming practices. Jackson and Sarah followed a few paces behind, their hands clasped, together in a moment of private recognition of the journey that had brought them here. From the brink of losing everything to becoming a national example of agricultural stewardship, their path had been transformed by the very qualities that defined their approach to farming: persistence, integrity, and faith in proven principles. As they rejoined the larger gathering, the atmosphere was charged with anticipation. Local citizens mingled with national media, environmental activists chatted with farmers, and children from the local schools waited excitedly to witness a presidential address from their small community. The president stepped to the podium that had been set up with the Miller farmhouse and fields as a backdrop. Cameras clicked and whirred as he began his remarks, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd and, via the assembled media, to the nation beyond. "Today, on this family farm in Willow Creek Valley, we stand at the intersection of America's agricultural heritage and its sustainable future," he began. "For 5 generations, the Miller family has worked this land not just to produce food, but to enhance the natural systems that make all agriculture possible." The president gestured toward the fields behind him. "What looks like simply well-tended farmland is actually a sophisticated environmental protection system. These fields filter water for 3 counties. They sequester carbon more effectively than many engineered solutions. They preserve genetic diversity through heritage seed cultivation. And they do all this while producing nutritious food that sustains this community." As the president continued outlining the Rural Heritage Protection Initiative, Jackson noticed faces in the crowd, neighbors who had recently avoided eye contact now nodding in appreciation, council members who had voted against his zoning appeals, now applauding the preservation of agricultural land, even former critics now seeing his farm through new eyes. This initiative will identify and protect agricultural properties that provide critical environmental services, the president explained. Through a combination of conservation easements, tax incentives, and direct support for sustainable practices, we will ensure that farms like the Millers continue their essential role in our environmental and food security. The formal announcement included designation of the Miller Farm as the initiative's first protected site, with funding for expanded educational programs and research partnerships with state universities. What had begun as a simple family farm would now serve as a living laboratory for agricultural sustainability and a model for the program's national implementation. As the president concluded his remarks, he turned to acknowledge the Miller family standing nearby. I want to thank Jackson, Sarah, and Emma Miller, not just for their hospitality today, but for their unwavering commitment to principles that benefit us all. When development threatened to pave over this precious resource, they didn't just fight for their family legacy. They stood up for clean water, healthy soil, and a sustainable future. The applause that followed was genuine and sustained, reflecting not just political courtesy, but community recognition of a deeper truth. The Millers' struggle had never been simply about one farm, but about the values that would shape their valley's future. After the formal remarks, the gathering transitioned into a community celebration. The president moved through the crowd, speaking with local farmers, environmental researchers, and eager schoolchildren. Jackson found himself in countless conversations with fellow citizens, many apologizing for not supporting his fight earlier or expressing new interest in sustainable farming methods. As the afternoon progressed, Jackson noticed Victor Lawrence standing at the periphery of the gathering, the developer's usual confidence replaced by the wary expression of someone whose calculations had gone disastrously wrong. When their eyes met across the crowd, Lawrence offered a curt nod before turning to leave. The gesture wasn't reconciliation, but rather acknowledgement of a decisive defeat. Later, as the president prepared to depart, he took a moment for a final, private word with the Miller family. What happened here in Willow Creek goes beyond environmental policy, he told them. It's about recognizing that true progress doesn't always mean bigger, newer, or more profitable. Sometimes it means protecting what works, what sustains, what connects us to both past and future. With final handshakes and expressions of gratitude, the president boarded Marine One for departure. As the helicopter lifted off, circling once over the Miller farm before heading toward Washington, Jackson felt a profound sense of closure and new beginning simultaneously. The crowd began to disperse gradually, community members lingering to help with cleanup or simply to absorb the historic significance of the day. Dr. Abernathy and his research team made arrangements for ongoing studies, while local teachers discussed plans to bring students for educational visits in the coming weeks. As evening approached, the farm slowly returned to its normal rhythms. The media trucks departed, the security perimeter was removed, and the extraordinary day began, its transition into memory and meaning. The Miller family gathered on their porch, watching the sunset paint the fields with golden light, just as it had done for generations, before any president took notice of their stewardship. "So, what happens tomorrow?" Emma asked, voicing the question that hung in the air after such a transformative experience. Jackson smiled, the wisdom of generations evident in his weathered face. "Tomorrow we do what Millers have always done. We tend the crops, care for the soil, and prepare for the seasons ahead." He gestured toward the fields. The land doesn't care about presidential visits or national initiatives. It responds to how we treat it, day after day, year after year. Sarah nodded in agreement. "Though I imagine the phone will be ringing quite a bit more than usual," she added with a smile. "The Organic Farmers Network has already called twice about sharing your watershed integration techniques." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Martha Wilson's pickup truck. The diner owner emerged carrying several containers. "Thought you might be too tired to cook after all this excitement," she announced, bringing the food onto the porch. "Besides, half the town wants to celebrate with you, but I figured you could use some peace and quiet tonight." As they shared the meal on the porch, watching darkness settle over the valley, the conversation turned to the future. The presidential designation would protect their farm from development, but more importantly, it would amplify the principles of stewardship they had practiced all along. "I've been thinking about the educational program," Emma said, her scientific mind already expanding the possibilities. "With the new funding, we could host workshops for conventional farmers transitioning to organic methods, develop curriculum for schools, maybe even establish a residency program for agricultural students." Jackson listened with pride as his daughter outlined her vision. The farm that he had feared might end with his generation would instead evolve into something that preserved its core values while adapting to new needs. The Miller agricultural legacy would continue not just through family bloodlines, but through the seeds of knowledge planted in all who came to learn from their experience. As night fell completely, the stars emerging in the clear sky above fields that had witnessed 5 generations of careful stewardship, Jackson Miller reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. What had seemed like the end of their way of life had instead become a new beginning, not just for their farm, but potentially for agricultural communities across the nation. The presidential motorcade that had arrived at their farm had brought more than political recognition. It had validated a vision of progress measured not in immediate profit, but in sustainability across generations. The Miller farm would now stand as living proof that the oldest wisdom, caring for the soil, respecting natural systems, practicing patient stewardship, remained the most innovative solution to modern environmental challenges. 2 months after the presidential visit, the Miller farm had transformed in subtle but significant ways. The foreclosure notices that had once covered their kitchen table were replaced by research partnerships, educational program plans, and letters from farmers across the country seeking guidance on sustainable practices. The natural spring that had been threatened by Horizon's development now supplied a demonstration wetland where visiting students learned about water filtration and aquifer recharge. The Heritage Seed Preservation Program had expanded with help from university resources, now housing one of the region's most comprehensive collections of heirloom crop varieties. On a warm summer morning, Jackson walked his fields as he had countless times before, checking plants and monitoring soil conditions with the practiced eye of a lifelong farmer. The work itself remained unchanged, the eternal cycle of planting, tending and harvesting that connected him to generations of millers before him. What had changed was the context, the recognition that these seemingly simple acts of agriculture represented sophisticated environmental stewardship worthy of national protection. At the crest of the hill where the president had stood, Jackson paused to survey the valley. The partially excavated Horizon development site was being transformed into a wetland restoration project, the company having sold the property to a conservation trust as part of their settlement with environmental authorities. Mayor Thompson, political survivor that he was, had fully embraced his new identity as champion of agricultural preservation. The proposed agricultural heritage zone had been approved unanimously, protecting family farms throughout the valley from development pressure while providing tax incentives for sustainable practices. In the distance, Jackson could see a school bus approaching along the farm's driveway. The first official tour group of the summer program was arriving, 30 middle school students coming to learn about watershed protection and sustainable farming. Emma would lead them through the educational stations she had designed, translating generations of agricultural wisdom into scientific concepts accessible to young minds. As Jackson made his way back toward the main buildings to greet the visitors, he reflected on how their very public victory had created ripple effects far beyond Willow Creek Valley. News reports indicated that farmers in communities across the country were using the Miller case to challenge inappropriate development and advocate for recognition of agriculture's environmental contributions. The Rural Heritage Protection Initiative had identified dozens of farms for the next phase of designation, each representing unique contributions to regional ecosystems while maintaining productive agricultural operations. What had begun with one family's stand against seemingly insurmountable odds was evolving into a national reconsideration of how we value agricultural land and practices. Sarah met him at the edge of the field, clipboard in hand, as she prepared to welcome the student group. "Ready to inspire some future farmers?" she asked with a smile. Jackson nodded, straightening slightly. "You know, my grandfather would never have imagined our farm becoming a classroom for the nation. He just did what he thought was right for the land, figuring the results would speak for themselves." "They did speak," Sarah replied, taking his hand. "It just took the right moment for people to finally listen." As they walked together toward the gathering of eager students, Jackson Miller carried with him the quiet confidence of a man who had stood by his principles when they were unpopular and inconvenient. The presidential motorcade that had once seemed an impossible dream had come and gone, but the true victory wasn't in that moment of recognition. It lay in the daily acts of stewardship that had preceded it and would continue long after. The patient, persistent care for soil and water that connected past to future through the working hands of those who understood that true wealth grew from the ground up. The sunlight caught the silver in Jackson's hair as he prepared to share with another generation the wisdom his family had cultivated alongside their crops. In that moment, he embodied the living bridge between agricultural heritage and sustainable future that his farm had come to represent, a testament to the power of principled persistence in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds, and a reminder that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply to continue the most fundamental. Work with integrity day after day, season after season, generation after generation. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.